And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. I want to introduce Joe Schreiber, who is the founder and CEO of appNovi. Thanks, Joe, for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I love interviewing entrepreneurs in this space because each one of you has a very unique story. And I love following these stories because they're so close to my heart, first and foremost, and then they're also very very interesting. So why don't we get started and just give us a quick overview, not so quick overview of your backgrounds, how you got started, what was your first roles, and then how you progress, and then jumping into the deep end and creating your own company.
Oh wow, you want to go way back, huh? I'm going to end up probably making myself appear way older than this face is showing you right now. But if you're asking me,
Joe, it's like dog years, right? Especially if you're in this space, right?
Yeah, especially in IT. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I started way earlier than probably most folks realize. I mean, I was about 15, helping to run an ISP down in South Florida. So I was one of the first ISPs to bring a tier 3 in-house, and that was for dial-up, by the way.
Hold on for a second. Did I hear 15? Is that even legal?
15. No, that was true. Yeah. So I had someone else that was 16 that was able to drive me to work, so that was really advantageous. But yeah, I really started young. I mean, I started programming probably when I was maybe 7 or 8, and this, again, dating myself, right? That was on, an 088 processor. I was literally learning to program by reading magazines. This was pre-internet days. In fact, my first internet actually came off of satellite. And, for me, it was kind of one of these things where, hey, the internet is the future, right? It's the technology of my generation, and I really want to be a part of it. And so I took what I had learned from those pre-internet days, and then really applied them, to the ISP. So I was setting up things like DNS servers, mail servers, shell servers, the remote access for the modems, and so forth. It was really quite an experience. And then, shortly thereafter, I think is when the .com.
Yeah,
they call it the bubble, right?
Yeah, and let me make that statement before we forget. So, you had the foresight to see this internet as a big thing. I remember people talking about, and I'm dating myself as well, is like, what is this internet, and how can we make money? It's all free. Remember, there was this point where like, okay, what's all this internet is all about? Like, everything's free. It's like, well, how are we going to make money? How is that going to make impact? If you remember that.
Yeah,
so
I mean, the commercialization of the internet took time, right? Yeah, so, in the beginning, it was really about, I remember the Netscape fish cam, right? I was like, wow, this is like the one of 3 sites on the internet that I can look on right now. I mean, even Amazon in the very beginning didn't even sell books off of their website, right? It took a while for e-commerce and so forth. But, really what happened was, the internet started going everywhere, and everyone could access the internet through dial-up. Back then, everyone remembers, or if you were old enough to remember, that sound. It's ingrained in my brain right now, and it's actually coming back to me. But I think when everyone got that access is when the commercialization started to occur, right? Because you get this classic chicken and egg with technology, right? Do I go where the users are, or do I make the market and hope the users come? And in this case, right, you really had both really come, because you had a lot of people like me that, did understand what the impact of the internet was going to be. And then you started reaching this threshold where there were enough people on the internet for people to really enact those visions that they had.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting. And then from there, you establish yourself as an expert, for certain areas within the kind of the cybersecurity space. And what was these roles that you took on? Because you work for enterprise, you work for vendors, and then fast forward, you came across a couple of different gaps that you wanted to fulfill and fill, and that's how you founded appNovi, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, I think from a security perspective, I was doing, security from, before it was a job role, right? Because, I think that one of the great qualities of someone in security is having this inherent paranoia, right? So if I'm setting up servers and I'm putting them on the internet, I most certainly want to make sure they're secure, right? So that mindset persisted all in my roles, whether I was writing code, then I want to make sure that I'm not writing vulnerable code. If I'm setting up infrastructure, I want to make sure that it's solid and reliable. And so that security mindset then propelled me into other roles, right? So, doing security administration, full stack development and so forth. But ultimately, I think what really hit the high point for me was when I took that security experience into the operations center. Right. So I worked at one of the largest, security operations centers in the world, and was able to, see these security problems at a scale that I hadn't before. And then what was most rewarding was to be able to bring resolution to those security problems at that scale as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So you developed these paranoia early on, and and paranoia is great. It keeps you alive, right? Both as on a physical level as well as the virtual world. So and you mentioned that, and again, you had the foresight of seeing that, because a lot of times, even in the early days, a lot of mistakes were done by people deploying servers without hardening them, without removing, like the default username and password and so on. But, what made you different? Do you think that, like, you had that kind of mindset to think securely when this wasn't, as you mentioned, it wasn't even a thing. There wasn't even a job description around that.
Yeah, I think the difference for me was that I was actually willing to ask and answer the question, what would happen if this got exploited, right? Or if there was a vulnerability. I think in the beginning, right, we're talking about when, Check Point put out the first firewall, right? This is how far back we're getting. So this idea of someone breaching an internal network was completely foreign, because one, most internal networks weren't even exposed. And then when they were, they had this mythical firewall in front of them that would protect them from all harm. But in reality, what we found, throughout this rise of security is that wasn't true, right? That, there was no magical device that was going to prevent you from experiencing these security woes. And so when we fast forward the industry, I think it's those people that started to concur with me. You hear the classic marketing, it's not if, it's when, right? That kind of fear talk and so forth. But for me, that's more or less about FUD than it is about practicality, right? So, you look at things like insurance, right? If you didn't think you were going to get sick, why get health insurance, right? So people are automatically kind of thinking that way, whether they know it or not. And security was the next really milestone for that, right? Just, you have to assume that you're at risk. You have to assume that you're vulnerable so that you can make the appropriate, task to secure yourself. And I think that was the fundamental blind spot in the beginning of information security, right? That, the firewall is there, or IDS or IPS or whatever it is. And that I think then the critical flaw became that, there wasn't a realization that attackers would grow in sophistication. And that was another classical miss. And now everyone understands that, and we're in this kind of cat and mouse game, as we probably will be in perpetuity.
Yeah, and I would like to dive into the comment you made that you joined an operations center, which one of the largest operations centers in the world, and then you start seeing the same issues but at scale. And this is something I like to kind of peel the onion a bit, because speaking to security professionals, a lot of times, minute, or relatively speaking, minute problems, when you scale them, or they're getting amplified. So an issue that in particular can seem almost like insignificant on a one or two machines, once you start looking at larger scale infrastructure, it becomes quite a cluster F. What was that your experience for you, and what type of experience did you have while you were working at operations center?
So I think there's two aspects to that. The first is what you described around the scope of the problem. So again, in the very early days, right, internal security was not that strong, right? So everyone was focused on that exterior barrier. And then when things would get in, right, if people remember like the flapper worm, right, and some of these other variants that just meandered their way through a network very quickly, right? That was the interesting thing to see at scale, right? When it starts with one asset, then 10, and there's this geometric progression, and all of a sudden, it's the majority of the network. But I think on the other side was the thing that I saw was really about the workflow in responding to these incidents. Because when you're doing these at scale and you have hundreds and hundreds of customers that each have thousands of events, right? You're talking about millions of events per day. And that's when the sense of scale really creeps in. So for me, it was really about a scalability problem on the human side, right? How do I take this analyst and scale their time to meet the needs of what we're doing in this SOC? And it came to the point where I started time tracking what they were doing in 2-second increments, right? Because, 2 seconds doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start to extrapolate 2 seconds over 20 analysts, over hundreds of events per day, right? 2 seconds savings can start to end up in 40 hours a week, right? And then 40 hours a week becomes a full-time employee, right? Which then can drive significant cost savings if you're able to actually do that scale correct.
Yeah, and I love that. I think that what you just mentioned specifically is true for a lot of different areas in our lives, right? The 2-second rule, like you start adding the small insignificant numbers, like just say, okay, if you take and read 10 minutes a day, you can finish the top 100 books pretty quick because it all adds up. So from your perspective, aside from that, what were your key takeaways in terms of how technology is being utilized at an enterprise such as that one? We see that all the time, that there are so many vendors, so many tools out there, and then yet we still use similar type of tools, and not in a very effective manner. It seems like the automation, orchestration piece has failed us for the longest time, because we still do a lot of manual labor.
Yeah, no, I remember, when SOAR was coming up, right? Everyone was talking about, the death of the tier one, right? That it'll be the machines and the algorithms and so forth that actually do the initial triage and so forth. And that really hasn't matured. As much as you said in the beginning interview about how unique I am, right? Security events are just as unique as those things, right? And so having an algorithm be that first tier of response has become problematic because of that. Now, automation definitely has helped, right? Because when you see the same event multiple times, you don't need a human being involved in that. I think what really has done a disservice in that meantime, or that interim between, really beefing up internal security to where we are now, is the reliance on tools to drive insights versus actually having humans look at data, right? I think those are very two distinct things. So I remember when I was in the SOC, I would watch the events come in through the SIEM, and maybe it was per client or what have you. And over time, I was able to notice, oh, well, this must be the HP OpenView scanner, right, going through, because it makes the same pattern of events going through. Or, oh, so-and-so must have just come into the office because they normally go to this website, and all of that. Because what happens in reality is humans are really good, particularly analysts, are really good at spotting patterns. And what happened, I think, in the last few years is that we've relinquished that ability in the hopes of ML and AI and automated insights like SOAR platforms to bring that to the user, right? It's kind of like, oh, we're gonna police a neighborhood by, setting up some cameras and so forth, right? Rather than have an officer, walk down the street and do observation and so forth. It's that deviation from what you normally see walking the beat, or me watching SIEM's event flow, that really kind of are the first hint at a problem. Because, one of the things that I always like to say about, fighting hackers and so forth, right, is they can't break the laws of physics, right? If you want to exfil 5 gigs of data out of an environment, you have to do that one packet at a time. So you're either going to have a long, slow connection, a large number of small connections, or one connection with a huge amount of volume and so forth, right? There's no magical way for them to get this data out. And if you have systems that are either looking at that, I mean, human being, or doing heuristical analysis, right? Those are the types of things that you should see. And I think what we're getting back to now is actually inserting humans back into that feedback loop. So I think SOAR started to take people out of it, right? Like, oh, let the machines do it. When the machines can't figure it out, we'll escalate to us, versus, hey, let me take my observations, let me plug those into the algorithm, into SOAR, and let it find certain things, and start letting computers do what they do best, and that's sift through and transform this data, and then let the humans still continue what they do best, which is spotting patterns and reacting.
It's interesting. So I was about to ask you whether the last security analyst has already been born, and then you counter that saying, well, no, there's still a long way to go, and we're still going to be kind of the in between the machine, and maybe assist the machine in making the right decisions, and the vice versa as well. And so during that time, you discovered a gap in kind of the tool set in terms of the ability to control. Maybe I'm not going to steal the thunder. What was that gap, and how did you come across it?
Well, I mean, I think there were really 2 gaps, right? So from a security perspective, I mean, the first one that's a major one is contextual understanding. I think I was victimized by this a lot. You would have someone call in about a particular asset, and then you would start asking questions, right? What's the role of this asset? Is it a web server? Is it a payment processing server, right? What is it connected to? Who do I call for this, right? All of that basic information that you would expect to be pre-collected just wasn't there. And so you're sitting there trying to make a decision with a huge blind spot in front of you, right? Quarantining something that is trivial in a business, like the menu server for a cafeteria, versus quarantining, the load balancer that accepts all of your e-commerce traffic. Those are 2 vastly different scenarios in which you need to make a decision in. And so a lot of times, you're kind of just guessing, and what frustrated me about that is you don't have to guess, right? The data is there, right? Someone created that server, someone is maintaining that server, someone is setting up that software. You have tools monitoring its behavior, you have tools auditing it, and so forth. So all this data you need to make the decision is floating around. And then the second aspect.
Yeah, but so Joe, before we go, I want to just put a pin on that. So when you say floating around, I was about to say that there are a lot of devices out there collecting, that telemetry, right? Collecting that information from the endpoint, from the servers. There's a lot of, and when you say floating around, define that. Let's kind of peel the onion a bit about what does that mean, floating around, and why is it so difficult to gather all that information and put it in such a place that you can make sense of it and contextualize it.
Well, you have 2 problems, right? So you're talking about a variety of data sources, right? So maybe it's network flow data, maybe it's IP reputation data, maybe it's malware analysis, right? All of these different domains, and then of course the different understanding of those domains. The second issue is classical organization silos, right? So nowadays, in the beginning, way back when I was doing it, there was one security guy, right, or woman, or what have you. And nowadays, security is a game of specialization, right? You have those really specialties like the malware analysis guy, me in the operations center, or what have you. But in an organization, typically those folks are in different silos, and so all that information may be floating around in those separate domains, but when you want to make an analytical decision, getting that data past those barriers, those silos, those domains has become very problematic. I think there was a big hope maybe with SIM that it would be the tool where everyone could kind of just,
Joe, you beat me to it.
their data.
You always beat me to it because I was about to say, hold on for a second. Is that what SIM's supposed to do? What about all these other aggregators out there? Because I've heard a couple times, well, throughout my career, I was saying, one single pane of glass with like, this aggregation of all different sources and overlay and so on. But that never materialized, right?
Well, it never materialized in a useful way, right? I think I look at it from a utilitarian perspective, right? So it's this idea of, hey, I'm going to take a SIM, and it's very much the same way akin to a data lake, right? I think it's the same problem where you're adding data, more and more data into this central location, but there's still a significant amount of barriers to excise that data out of the lake or the SIM, right? So SIMs were really good about getting data in, right? ETL, normalization, correlation, et cetera. All of those things were great, right? And they really helped me kind of stop drinking from the fire hose when I was doing analysis, right? Because I could prune that data, I could summarize it, and so forth. But that was me as an analyst, right? Doing my own thing. If I go back to the customer and I say, hey, do you want to see your security event? Right. And I start taking out, spreadsheets and SQL queries and all this stuff, their eyes are going to, kind of glaze over. Right. So when I look at the SIM problem, the real issue with it was getting data out. Right. So, you look at these guys, you either have custom query languages that you need to do with or deal with, reliability issues, getting that data. Time was another factor. Right. Sometimes, an event would come in at the end of an hour, but processing didn't occur to the end of the hour or vice versa. So you were waiting an hour, right, for this cron job to basically kick in, which is delaying your insights as well.
And on top of that, it was a lot of the time, it was a review mirror, like kind of view where you're looking at things that happened already, right? Is that also a correct statement? Most times it was.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I think what really, accelerated us getting to see data in real time would be endpoint, right? You look at those guys or folks that were doing that immediate incident response. They would actually go out live to a machine, grab the memory out of it, do analysis and so forth. And that was relatively new, right? Because, when I was doing, say, IDS analysis, right, you would have the event come in, the IDS would see it, then it would be normalized, and it would go through the SIM. There might be 20 minutes go by before I even see the alert, and then another 20 minutes to do my triage and so forth. So there might be a half an hour to an hour before I'm even notifying the customer about an issue that I saw. And then, of course, time is a killer in security, right? So all that time was occurred, maybe like we said earlier about one of the worms, right? So all that time I'm sitting here investigating worm, it's spreading to machine to machine to machine without the ability to quarantine and slow it down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now that was like the kind of the first item, and then there was another. Bringing back to the original discussion, there was another piece of it. They said there was missing that you were looking at, and you decided to go ahead and solve that as well.
Yeah, the second piece goes back to that access to the data. Right. So that occurred to me in kind of those two things that I described. One would be getting actual access to the data. I remember having to call up and plead with, managers and so forth. Can I get API credentials to that tool that you bought? Right. And it wasn't at the point where the SIM was grabbing everything and so forth. So you had that physical access. But I think what was more troublesome was the technical barrier. Right. So if I went out and I had 20 analysts on my staff, right, what are the odds that all 20 know SQL? Probably pretty low. And then what are the odds that of those 20, they know some query language that the vendor made up, right? That's probably zero. So now I'm at a training backlog and an education backlog and so forth. And then I'm taking the analyst out of the seat in order to gain that knowledge. That is a big problem that we address at appNovi, right? Really simplifying the access to that data and then simplifying the access to the insights. So, when you load up appNovi, right, we don't present you with a ton of dialogues, a lot of menus. It's very much like a Google-like experience, right? What is your issue today? So when we look at something more recent like Log4j, I think about what our customers were doing, before appNovi. They were going out and doing kind of the human correlation, right? They were going out to maybe one database, finding out where Log4j might be installed, potentially installed, then cross-correlating that with maybe what their vulnerability scanner has found and so forth, and then overlaying that maybe with network data to see what the exposure risk and so forth is. So, and all of those steps may require a huge technical understanding, right? Each vendor has its own API, maybe its own query language. Then you're doing data transformation in order to get that correlated and normalized and so forth. A lot of work versus appNovi, you just literally go to the search box and type log4j, right? And the software model comes up, and then you expand and you can explore and find out the scope of the issue that you have with log4j.
And coming back to this particular example, the context is cardinal, is critical, right? So in the sense that, for example, you can have a log4j, it's innocuous because it's not communicating to the outside world. So even though you have the vulnerability in a certain item, appNovi will most likely show you that it's not communicating to external sources, and therefore you can fix it at some other time. So it's all about prioritization, right? To figure out what is the impact for that particular vulnerability, what's going to impact it in the kill chain if that vulnerability is going to get exploited. So it's all about the context. Is that correct statement?
Yeah, and that's very much true. And that's where I think we ran into another problem with vendors in the past from a practitioner perspective would be around risk scoring, right? So, you go out, you run a vulnerability scanner or whatever it is, and it returns this arbitrary score, about your asset or the vulnerability that it finds without taking into account that context, right? So, how does a vulnerability scanner know that this asset is in a lab without internet versus into a public cloud, right? It just simply doesn't. And so at appNovi, we really resisted kind of building our own risk score, right? Putting out, an appNovi quotient, if you will, right? That is not something we ever wanted to do. Not to mention, the customer feedback was pretty blunt about black box risk scoring. I'll keep it PC, right? They just said they don't want it, right? And they didn't want it vehemently. So when we look at risk at appNovi, what we're able to do is help users build their own risk score inside the product. So, then you can take into account that context. And since at appNovi, we're ingesting all this various information, not only do we understand, what that asset is or that software role is, we understand the complete connectivity picture, right? How does that asset get to the internet? How does that asset talk to other assets? How does that asset relate to the business, right? What applications are on top of that, riding on top of that network flow, and so forth? And you can use all of those attributes to derive a risk score so that when you go to do that prioritization, you're not chasing the remediation inside a lab environment. You're chasing it where it really matters, publicly facing assets and so on.
So you play in the the cyber asset attack surface management, the CASM space, right? But you also do some other, there's another additional functionality. So let's kind of dig in. So first of all, maybe just for the audience is not so familiar with this particular term, what is cyber asset? Let's kind of define that, and then talk about the attack surface management. And because these are fairly, this whole practice is fairly new, right? It was defined by Gartner not too long ago. So maybe we kind of define those before we discuss a little further.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see, more categories, right? I think threat exposure management, right, is another one coming up. What you're really finding with all of these categories is that one discipline is not enough for security, right? So understanding your assets, it's great, right? I understand what I have, what's on it, and so forth. But that's not really enough to make a security decision about what you need to do, right? You need to understand the connectivity. You may need to understand deeper about the software on a box and so forth. So you need to go beyond all of, or you need to actually really combine all of these separate disciplines in one platform to really make a decision. And CASM is a great example of that, right? So let's take, risk exposure, asset management, attack surface not necessarily management, but attack surface understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is the attack path into my environment? Is it external, internal, and so forth, right? Let's take all of those disciplines and then create a system that allows the user to really manage all of that risk. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about, right? You know, we go back to earlier about, you know, it's not if, it's when, right? That kind of thing. And so security is really about risk mitigation, not risk prevention. And so for me, when we look at all of these disciplines, we're able to really help users decide when and how to mitigate, you know. So, you know, it may be faster, like the classic Transformers movie, to go out and cut the hard line, right, of an asset than it is to sit there and triage, you know, and dump the memory of a box and do analysis before you turn it off and so forth. You know, but you can't make that decision on which action to take without getting a complete understanding of all that data. And that's really where we come in, right? So we can help you understand whether you want to, you know, take the axe to the hard line like the movie, or do a very careful triage, or maybe even, you know, go beyond that and you know, start doing deception and so forth and other activities to really understand what your attacker is doing.
And it's so interesting. So companies now, you know, some of them are investing in asset management tools, but you're mentioning specifically that it may not be the end all be all, because it's one thing to have an asset management. Okay, now I know where my assets are, but okay, now what? You know, so what would you recommend to companies that are looking at this particular space, to wait, or to look at appNovi, for example, or, you know, where is this all going? Are these companies going to add additional risk mitigation capabilities or risk, you know, review mechanism, or they're still going to be in the, you know, the asset management space?
Well, I'm a bit biased, right, running a company, right? So I'm going to tell you, hey, go out and buy appNovi, right? But I think what really is really important is to really understand what data you have available to you now, right? Go and do a hard look at what's in your data lake, right? Do you have endpoint information? Do you have network information, right? And if there's data gaps in any of those spaces, that's when you want to go out and grab one of those point solutions to really help you fill that gap. But after you get to that point where, you know, a lot of folks get data saturation, right? I have plenty of data in my lake, right? But I'm having a really hard time exfilling, you know, insights out of that. That's where appNovi comes in, right? So appNovi allows you to ingest all of that different information, right? And I think that's really a key unique factor to appNovi, is the way we ingest data. It doesn't matter whether that data is sitting in a data lake. Maybe it's in transit, something like NetFlow, or even more, you know, probably pernicious, right, is data sitting inside someone's head, right? Because that's the classic, you know, what happens if this person wins the lottery and they leave the company, right? What data are they taking with them? That kind of classical.
Joe, you're so positive. Typically people say, well, what if the person gets hit by the bus? But you have the whole.
I used to say hit by the bus, and then you know, I was flagged for my cynicism, just like you, right? So I started saying, hey, let's get a little more optimistic, right? I'm going to win the lottery.
That's when you turn entrepreneur, like everything's optimistic, right? So you have to have.
Yeah, or maybe in my case, you know, when I get a horn growing out of my forehead, right? That'll be the time.
Hey, but you know, I also hear there's a bit of magic in terms of what you do at appNovi, and you know, one of the magic that I'm hearing is that the ability to grab data from all the various sources, that by itself is not an easy task, because the data is, you know, the way you you know, extract that data. And so there's one thing is, when you extract it, and that also not trivial, because the format, unfortunately, is not the same, right? It's always an ever-changing task to be able to siphon that data through APIs. The API may change, you know, the way you source, and then to be able to then take that and capture in a meaningful way, that you can then make sense of it, so you can operate, you know, the certain algorithms over it. How do you do all of that? And then how do you do that at scale? Because again, you come from a you know, scalable operation. How do you manage to do that at appNovi in such a scale, in such a way that you can easily integrate various sources and then, you know, operate on them in very large scale?
So I mean, to address scale, right? Architecture is key. Right? So everyone has, you know, moved away from the classic monolith these days, right? No one is hopefully building applications in that manner anymore. And so at appNovi, you know, we don't either, right? So What we're able to do is use modern tools to use what's right for the right data ingestion, right? If it's streaming, right, we're looking at those type of tools. If it's data at rest, right, we're able to look at different ways to acquire from this acquisition method, right? Whether it's API, whether it's receiving data as well, right? Using all of those tools and putting them into really a really qualified abstraction layer comes next, right? So as you said, right, this data comes from a variety of sources. It's a variety of things. If you don't apply some type of homogenation to that data, you'll never really be able to start classifying things, reconciling things as well. So that's really important. I think the second thing for us was we never wanted to put a user at appNovi to a disadvantage when it came to data ingestion or exfil. And so throughout the product, we made an insistence that we will always use common languages to enable the user to do those things. So Python is pretty common throughout our product, right? We allow users to create their own plugins, connectors, what have you, with a built-in IDE in the product, right? So Python is, I think, the second most used language in the world right now. So that barrier to entry is very low, right? Because anytime a user needs to ingest something new or leverage another data source, there's probably a Python library already out there. And if we haven't gotten to it at appNovi yet, that means the user can just kind of include that library, do some really basic, quick ETL, and get it into appNovi inside to our abstraction layer, where it can then live with the rest of the data that we ingest.
It sounds to me like this tool was built by practitioners for practitioners, the way you describe it. And I also noticed one other thing is that you don't like the black box approach, and you're very open about the kind of the underlying. You open up the kimono for for lack of a better term, for other practitioners to look inside and see how how the data is collected, how the data is stored, and potentially they have the ability to influence that and just and be able to operate on that the way they want it to do. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, there is nothing inside appNovi that was built for like a single purpose. When users started to say, we need a more advanced way to write queries or export this data or something like that, you could very easily, and in most mentalities, go and write like a one-off, right? I'll write you a quick way to make a PDF export, or I'll allow you to kind of click here and make these queries and so forth. We want to go beyond that, right? So it's really important for us to listen to the use case of what a user is trying to do, and then build something extensible that meets that use case, not something that's a one-off. Because what ultimately, as we grow and mature as a platform, all of that functionality that's extensible allows users to build on top of things, right? And when you look at software, that's how it is, right? So when I go out and I code something in Python, what am I not doing, right? I'm not converting it to assembly so the CPU can understand it, right? I'm not writing low-level hardware abstraction and so forth to get to the bits and bytes of the computer. I'm building on top of the work that other developers have done, through decades of work. And that's how we see appNovi, right? So one user can go out and build a plugin to grab some data. Now that data is available to all the other users. Those users can then find that data. Maybe they want to build a certain risk algorithm or query on it. They can build that query. Then that query itself is now available in the search box, into charting and other things. So they can use it. So, when someone puts up maybe one of our dashboard wizards, there might be the work of 5 or 6 people underneath that. And that's what we want to really enable at appNovi.
So before we part ways, and this was a really enlightening discussion, and I appreciate the time. Let's talk a bit about, you mentioned some use cases. So from your experience as the founder and CEO of the company, what are currently the top 3 use cases of why people purchase appNovi today?
The first one would be prioritization, right? As I think we mentioned a few times, right? How do I know what to attack first So vulnerability prioritization is a big one for us. I think one of my favorite use cases, though, is probably more general than you would expect, which is the ability to communicate that data to others. And I think that's really gone underserved. So when we look at how we share data, we want to share it in the most immersive and direct way possible to that user. So, for example, we'll go back to vulnerability prioritization. What happens is someone in that organization will run a scan. It'll come back with this PDF or XML or whatever. Someone who understands the results will freak out and go, "Oh my God, Sev 1, whatever it is." And then for them to initiate action, they generally need to get management approval, right? So the manager is going to ask, "Well, what's the issue?" So then they typically will send out that PDF or that other data that they got, and they have this expectation that the manager completely understands that. And I think that's a flawed understanding. So rather than send someone the vulnerability report out of that native product, you can send what we call a snapshot in appNovi that shows the vulnerability, the asset it's connected to, what assets those assets connect to, and then maybe what applications are being driven by those assets in that environment. So when a manager looks at it, he gets to choose his perspective on how he gets to assess that risk, right? So right away, he can say, that application, no big deal, don't care about that. Oh, that asset is in a cloud that's not important to us, let's move on, right? He can very visually identify that risk that he needs to remediate. And that's really important to us, as we talked about earlier with breaking down silos and so forth. And I think the third one for me, sorry, I know I'm deviating from these market-driven use cases, right? But I think the third one that's
Joe,
that's
so
really,
so the market-driven, and not to cut you off, but I think you hit the nail on the head. So this is what at least from my experience, tools always do multiple things, right? So when you buy a platform or any kind of tools, they do 50 different things. And what's interesting is that, a lot of times the developers and the practitioners like yourself that created this tool may create it for, the top 3 reasons, but people buy it for reason number 10 and 15. Almost as a byproduct, but it's actually more urgent to them than. So you basically described just that. So the tool does a lot of things, and is just asset management and vulnerability and so on and review. But at the end of the day, there are certain underlying issues that needs to be solved right now, and it's urgent and is burning. And this is typically why people would purchase and deploy and so on. That's why, at least what I found. So so you're doing great. Thank you.
Right. Appreciate that. That. So, I think the third one for me, as I was saying, in my mind was exploration, right? So, threat hunting is kind of a newer activity and so forth, but in reality, what that is exploration, right? Let me start somewhere and see where I end up. And just as much as I'm a practitioner, I'm also an eater of dog food, right? So appNovi sits on top of my network. I think I have, probably a few hundred nodes actually in my environment, which is probably atypical for most home networks. But, I was able to find things in my network that I didn't know were happening, and that came really across from understanding connectivity, right? Once I started getting in, NetFlow data, vulnerability data, I started adding things in like message queues, right? And other aspects of what my home network does. I really started to understand the interconnectivity of things. And what it really opened up my eyes was to resiliency, in this case, that I found through exploration, right? I would start somewhere, and then I would end up finding out that, oh, wow, based on this, what I'm seeing on my screen, I have a single point of failure here, right? I have a single point of failure here. This is not redundant, or I also remember finding things on my network that were misconfigured, right? They were going out to DNS servers that didn't exist anymore, right? These were things that I would not see like in typical products. And then there were things that I wouldn't be able to understand without that full context, right? I may get IDS alerts and so forth, but none of those is really helping me find a misconfigured server, with DNS and so on.
It's not as sexy. Exploration is not as sexy as threat hunting. Just the term itself, but it sounds like it can be even more useful.
Sounds cooler.
Yeah, and then your proactive is versus reactive. Threat hunting is typically after the fact, but you are looking at the weakest link and some potential vulnerabilities within the networks that are pre-breach or pre-vulnerability or pre-incident and so on. So so people listen to this interview and they'll say, okay, how do I get this? Like, what's the experience like? What should I experience the first 7 to 10 days of deploying this? What's the usual experience? What are kind of the usual findings? Benefits that you can get, because it's all about today it's all about ROI. If we spend X dollars, we want to get 10x back. So what can they expect? And maybe talk to me about the experience.
Well, I mean, speaking from the company point of view, right, the experience is fairly seamless, right? Installation, the most common thing we hear after installation was, that's it. Very simple installation process. But from a user experience point of view, I think one of the most common things we run into is surprises. And those are my favorite, right? Because a user will start to add data into appNovi. They'll start, exploring or maybe more glorified threat hunting, right, throughout the platform, and they'll start to discover things that they didn't know. We had one user that came through. They clicked on an Amazon account and they expanded it, and it said that they had 28 VPCs. And their first response back to us was, "Hey, I don't think your product works. I don't have that many VPCs." And my reply back to them is, well, look, code doesn't lie, right? So let's go back and take a look. And sure enough, they log into the Amazon console. They do a search, which by the way, took probably 8 times as long as doing it in appNovi, right? And sure enough, all of those things, all of those VPCs were present, right? And I think one of the things that people don't see often enough is that interconnectivity of their data and their assets and so forth. And that's what really surprises people the most, right? I didn't realize that this server was talking to this server, or I didn't realize this vulnerability was in 400 places in my network, right? That's a lot of what happens, right? And then what we try to do, or what we're getting much better at, is turning that exploration and surprises into repeatable queries that you can then do or commit action to, right? So,
and you do that in the multi-cloud environment as well. It's important to say that it's not just for AWS; it's also for other forms of
Oh, like absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if your toaster has an API, we will put it into appNovi, right? So AWS, Azure, it's all indiscriminate to us.
And then Joe, I would also mention that the kind of the so what, okay, the person had 28 VPCs as opposed and didn't know about it. But I would say that it's a big deal, because there's so many issues that happen when people, spinning off test environment, forgetting to shut them down. So, first of all, you pay fortunate by leaving these VPCs on for extended period of time, because you get charged of it. But on top of that, you may have a misconfigured S3 bucket that was non-production, and with some PII data, and then and so she wrote, right. This is like the next big iteration of your next breach or next leak. So it's a big deal to find infrastructure that's you didn't know it was there, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a lot of the downfalls of that, right? There's cost, right? There's data exposure. And then, of course, the one that companies are getting more attuned to, right, is brand risk. Those things matter to the public, right, from a trust point of view. And so whatever you can do to find those before, someone with polite disclosure, or hopefully before someone without that, that's really important. And as we go, for us, as we want to get more and more advanced, right, and start finding those surprises for folks as we get more feedback from our users. And again, going back to that feedback loop we talked about in the SOC, right? I can take feedback from one user, apply that into appNovi, and then send that feedback and process loop to all of our appNovi users.
And I don't know if you mentioned, but what's the deployment model? Like, how do you deploy this
deployment tool? Model for us is actually Docker based, right? So we can go and install wherever you want, right? Whether that's in public cloud, private cloud, bare metal, what have you. It really doesn't matter to us. And we went with that model because at appNovi we try to follow the data, right? So data lakes are typically on-prem, or maybe they're inside a virtual private cloud and so forth. So we want to install alongside of that versus saying, hey, if we had a SaaS endpoint, right, at some point you're going to have to cross the internet or a private peer or something else. And then, of course, you have to pay for that exfil too. So if we can get close to the data, it's much better for us. And the other advantage to installing that way means that you still own the server. Right. So if you have your own compliance requirements, data storage, encryption, right, whatever that is, you can enact all of those without appNovi being in the way, right, which is a classical flaw of the appliance model, right? I have to be responsible for OS updates and, my SSH doesn't use a large enough key for your compliance requirements and so on, right? We alleviate all of that by just running in Docker space.
Super. So before we part ways, I want to make sure that people know how to reach out to you for either looking into additional information for appNovi, just getting in touch, whatever that may be. What's the easiest way?
Oh, the easiest way is to view our website, right, appnovi.com, or find me on LinkedIn if you want as well. Send me a message. But yeah, try to use the demo link, right? Get it down and see if appNovi will work for you.
Super. So Joe Schreiber, CEO and co-founder of appNovi, thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. Thanks for joining. Looking forward to seeing you at the next event. Until then,
thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.